Now, would you believe someone actually wrote that line? Unexpected item in the bagging area, okay? Now, for those of you who are too grand to know what it means, how many people don't know what it means? Have never heard that line? Few of you are too grand to do your own shopping, or indeed you're very, very early adopters of online delivery. No, it's what happens if you try and shop for yourself at Sainsbury's or Tesco, and you put accidentally, while you're actually moving things from your basket into that little weighing thing, after you've scanned it, if you put anything that you haven't scanned that weighs more than a gnat's fart on the area to the right, a voice which they researched, and they decided after considerable market research to make it a female voice, actually says unexpected item in the bagging area. Now, I think we can say that was probably written by a software engineer. The only possible defense was that it was written by a massive fan of the early James Bond films, who only after a considerable amount of persuasion by his boss was actually persuaded not to prefix it with a loud klaxon, and having 5 or 6 people in red overalls come running out with submachine guns into the shopping area of Sainsbury's. That's the only possible place. An early James Bond film is the only possible place you could ever have a spoken announcement that says unexpected item in the bagging area. I mean, short of saying, you know, Hal, open the pod bay doors, it's hard to think of a less human-friendly way to actually address the problem. It does practically nothing, it explains nothing, and actually just fills you with terror. And so what I'm doing is, it's a gentle attack actually on the engineering culture, which is glorious and wonderful and has done most of the fine things we've actually seen over the last 100 years, but if left unchecked, can lead to the most monstrous pain. And the vital thing to remember is, my point is very, very simple today. If you accept that all these things, engineering, mathematics, economics, technology, are to some extent subordinate to human psychology, then I think we have a great future ahead of us. If you believe that human psychology and human nature should be subordinated to them, then we have a problem. Now, at its best, I think we can do lovely things like this. In theory.
Business, a modern piece of glasswork down on the corner that you walk each day in passing. The elderly sales clerk won't ask with suspicion. The whole of motor corporation's giving its permission. A little stairway, a little piece of carpet, a pair of mirrors that are facing one another, out in both directions, 1,000 little Julias, they come together in the middle of Manhattan. You waited since lunch, it all comes at once.
Famous Williams. I just like a lot more of that. I like a lot more opportunities to delight, to charm, to amuse. And what that does is it marries the human and the technological in a healthy and equal mix. And this is my belief that the new sweet spot in virtually anything, in business, in government, actually in environmentalism as well, in terms of actually getting people to appreciate more from fewer resources, I think it all lies in this sweet spot between the three. The overlap between technology, psychology, and an understanding of economics. And I think it's always the best ideas come from all three. One of my heroes bizarre guy. Anybody heard of Ludwig von Mises? This is far too small. In an American audience, about a third of you would have heard of him, and they would have also been libertarian Tea Party nutters, incidentally, but at least they would have heard of him. And I think that's a good thing. I actually got that from a bumper sticker selection online. In the US, you can actually buy a bumper sticker that says, Ludwig von Mises is my hero. It was an interesting bumper sticker shop because it showed the only example I've ever come across of neo-Nazi wit. Which was that there's a bumper sticker sold in the States, very popular with fundamentalist Christians, which says, my boss is a Jewish carpenter. And the Nazis got their own back with a sticker that said, my boss is an Austrian painter, which I have to say, I don't like it, but it's kind of funny. Now, Ludwig von Mises didn't coin this word, but he used it. It's praxeology. And praxeology is the study of human decision-making and action. Now, the point that von Mises made, which is so important, is he believed that economics as a discipline was subordinate to praxeology. That economics exists as a subset of... Now, von Mises came from the Austrian school of economics, and they were sort of active at the time of Freud. So they believed fundamentally that you could only understand economics by understanding psychology. It's a very, very stark difference from the kind of managerialist neoclassical model we tend to put up with today, which is that anybody whose behavior deviates from that predicted, from the superlogical, calculating Homo economicus model, which is posited by the perfectly efficient market hypothesis, anybody actually deviating from that model is believed to be being irrational or somehow wrong. And the expectation is that human behavior should conform with the model. The problem, of course, comes from physics envy. That economists actually always felt awkward, as indeed do most social scientists, meteorologists, climate scientists, and so forth, that their science doesn't have the same numerical level of perfection and predictability that physics does. There's a very good reason for that, of course. It's much more complicated. Great example of Paul Dirac, a fantastic mathematician, who was asked by a second-rate economist, why don't you become an economist? To which he simply replied, I couldn't, the maths is too difficult. He understood that when you're actually trying to predict the behavior of people who interact and actually influence each other, then the kind of mathematical thing that emerges is vastly more complicated than understanding the extension of a spring or the expansion of a gas under heating. Now, there are a few of my heroes who are people who deviate from, who effectively move us away from physics envy, from this obsession, which has been actually very heavily driven by an invention that's, a technological invention that hasn't been remarked upon nearly enough. Quite a lot of technology that has massive effects we don't even notice. Along with the internet, one of the most significant inventions of the last 25 or 30 years, actually it's an older invention than that, but it's a development of the last 30 to 35 years, was containerization. But unless you're in the containerization business or actually drive a lorry, you haven't been much aware of it. The effect economically has been absolutely spectacular. One other report suggests that about 1 percentage point of America's GDP growth over a 10-year period was purely attributable to advances in distribution by Walmart. Now, those are things that happen behind the scenes and don't get articles. Actually, in fairness, they do get articles in Wired, but generally we don't read about them in our spare time, unless we're slightly strange. Interestingly, one of the most significant things, I think, in terms of human behavior and the effect it's had on the way business runs was actually the invention of the spreadsheet, something of enormous significance, which was actually talked about. Its social and other significance has been talked about far too little. Because what it's done is it's given disproportionate power to anybody who can actually contrive a metric which is numerically expressible. The problem with that is that not all things that really matter to people are numerically expressible in the first place. It's much easier to have a metric for how fast a train is than versus how comfortable it is or how enjoyable the journey is. Moreover, many of those metrics do not actually benefit humanity on anything like a linear scale. Now, here are three people I admire for their dissent. The Austrian school, von Mises on the left, standing in as an advertisement for the high quality of pre-Anschluss Austrian tailoring. On the top right, Daniel Kahneman, the founding father of behavioral economics. And on the bottom right, a particular hero of mine, a guy called John James Cowperthwaite, whom nobody has heard of. Am I fair on that? He was the chief economic secretary to Hong Kong from about 1961. Some people argue actually was responsible for, if you include his influence on China, the greatest creation of wealth in history. And the reason is he arrived as the economic secretary in Hong Kong, not as an economist, he was a classicist, I'm proud to say, and indulged basically in a policy of active non-intervention. to such an extent that one of his policies was that he banned the collection of economic statistics on the grounds that they might encourage people to interfere. All of these three people, the Austrian school, refused to use maths in economics for a complex and arcane argument. But they argue that since actually human preference and decision-making can only be expressed ordinally, not cardinally, then mathematical equations are an imperfect representation of human preference. Now, Einstein, you could add to that number, actually, who said, not everything that counts can be counted and not everything that can be counted counts. You could add him to the people who've sort of opposed this kind of rule of the arithmocracy, as a friend of mine calls it, the autistocracy, if we're being less kind. A breed of people, a sort of managerialist cult, which in many ways, contrary to the expectations of Marx, has actually seized control of the levers and measures of business in banks, in boardrooms, and has succeeded in ripping off both capital and labor, something I don't think any Marxist actually predicted. You could add actually to their number, if I'm allowed, a very small client arse-lick, not quite an arse-lick, more just a sort of brief tongue flick in the anal direction. Our client Paul Polman at Unilever, who I think has taken a very valuable step in actually refusing to report Unilever's figures quarterly. He simply says, you don't want quarterly figures for anything you can learn from them. You simply want quarterly figures so you can produce specious reports which create market volatility from which you can make money. He says, if you want quarterly reports, we don't want you as a shareholder. I think that's a spectacularly interesting stance. So forgive me that brief grovel, but I think it's important. This is what happens when you get decisions made by economists, by management consultants, most of whom have an engineering background, in that they have something in common actually with nearly all fundamentalist terrorists. The most effective form of airline profiling, if you want to spot a suicide bomber, is not to look at skin color, ethnicity, or religion. It's ask them what they did at university. If they studied engineering, marigolds on, basically. And there's a reason for this, according to Gambetta and Hertog, two sociologists, who posited that engineering creates in the brain an extraordinary discomfort with any form of ambiguity, because engineering is all about the elimination of ambiguity. As a result, they're drawn to an interpretation of religion, which is, for all its strengths or faults, is spectacularly unambiguous. Because ordinary human behavior is simply too fuzzy and weird for them to cope with. Therefore, they seek a system by which to live which allows for absolutely no ambiguity or fuzziness at all. What you also get at a much less serious level is this. The whole riot over student tuition fees was first and foremost a failure of psychological understanding. Whatever you think of the rights or wrongs of students paying for tuition, there was absolutely no need whatsoever to name what the headline loan amount was, £9,000 a year, I think it turned out to be. If you'd gone to people and said, let's imagine someone who lives in a council flat, the very sort of person you should be encouraging to go to university. The family's most valuable possession is a second-hand car worth £3,000. You're suggesting to them that in order to go into university, their first decision will be to get £27,000 into debt. This is absolutely terrifying. Imagine exactly the same proposition framed to them in terms of you pay absolutely nothing now, but if at the age of 30 you're earning £40,000 a year, you pay another 3% on income tax. Chance to be a fine thing, would be the reaction. No one trying to sell cars on credit would emphasize the overall headline amount. This was sheer insanity. It was division of policy by economists who genuinely believe that actually economic facts have the same effect on us regardless of how they're presented. And if behavioral economics teaches one thing, this is emphatically not true. Most of us don't save enough. I asked a question of a banker. I said, why don't you present savings plans to people in ways that interest them? Okay? Why don't you have a savings plan that says double your money in 8 years? They said, we're not allowed to do it legally. We have to express this as an APR, which nobody understands. Least of all do they understand compound interest. If you went to most people, I suggest, and said, I know which horse is going to win the Derby at evens in 8 years' time, and I can place a bet for you, the only condition is you have to pay me the money now, most people would take that bet. Expressed as 6.1% APR, unless you're a spectacularly weird person, I posit that that's a less exciting prospect. Now, what behavioral economics is about is simply understanding how people really think, react, and act, rather than, rather than how economic models, devised largely for the convenience of spreadsheets and for economists and accountants and engineers suffering from physics envy, how they're supposed to act. This is a Don Draper quote. He makes the point that it's a perfectly creative act to realize that $9.99 seems a bit less than $10. I think this is a great creative idea. Every time I buy eggs, I always buy free-range eggs because I'm not a total shit. I'm a bit of a jag driver, but I'm not a total arsehole. But then when I'm presented with 9 opportunities of free-range eggs, I always have this very, very brief 0.5 seconds of dilemma, which is, do I buy 6 or do I buy 12? How many of you have the same thing? Okay? Enough, okay? And it's also, I've got children, so if you buy 6, they'll bloody well decide to make cupcakes. You get up on Saturday morning, you've got nothing to go with your bacon. On the other hand, if you buy 12, it might be a bit wasteful. Waitrose, bang. Immediate end of dilemma, resulting in total comfortable purchase. 9. They also do them in 4 for old people or people who are worried about constipation. Here's a great idea which comes right into the sweet spot. Remember that? Technology, economics, psychology. There's a huge problem with the NHS with people not turning up to appointments, not only GPs appointments, but consultants appointments. They're consultants on £1,000 or £2,000 an hour. And there's a huge problem that people fail to show, and it costs the NHS an enormous amount of money. What the NHS was doing was putting notices up in doctors' surgeries saying, last month, 74 people failed to show for their appointment. Make sure you're not one of them. Now, a behavioral economist knows one thing, that actually making something seem a social norm, that lots of people do it, massively decreases the stigma of doing it yourself. My reaction to that notice would have been, well, they're not going to notice if it's 75 then, are they? The second thing is the media placement of that thing is absolutely terrible, because the only people who see it are people who are already at the GP surgery. And therefore, the people who are actually offenders don't actually see the message at all. It's very similar to that peculiar advertising habit. I don't know if anybody's worked with a train company, where they insist on doing all their advertisements saying it's great to take the train, and they will only run them on railway stations, because it's more expensive if you run them somewhere else. Okay? Now, the technical solution to this is very simple. You text people like Ocado does in advance and say, don't forget you've got an appointment tomorrow. That embraces economics and technology, and it's a good solution. It works. An even better one is to say, can we expect to see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock for your appointment, and get them to reply with the word yes. Why? Simple insight into behavioral economics. If you get people to act, a thing called basic consistency bias, confirmation bias, means having acted, they are much more likely to actually follow through. Now, the vital thing about that, actually, some dentists, actually, you may notice this, they don't give you an appointment card already filled out. They hand you a blank appointment card and say, can you write down Monday, 12th of October, 3 p.m. If you write the card out yourself, you're more likely to turn up at the appointment. It's a simple question of interesting bias. Now, I think this is vitally important, because when you realize how much technological effort and how much economic effort is actually takes place blind to what people will and won't actually do and how you can encourage them to do it, you realize actually that there's an enormous amount of potential extra efficiency in the system which could be gained if you just added that third dimension of psychology. This is one small thing I've managed to achieve in New Zealand with Westpac Bank, thanks to an agency, BBDO, who took on my idea, which was the impulse saver. My argument is that there are thousands of opportunities for us to impulse spend, but bankers, because they're fundamentally weird people, have never created opportunities for us to impulse save. A savings product actually requires you to ring up someone to send you bits of paper full of legal copy. By the way, legal copy is interesting because lawyers actually think that legal copy is reassuring. If you're not a lawyer, your reaction is terrified, okay? But actually, and then they make you fill in. Now, how many shoe shops would do any business if you created the kind of bureaucratic pain and agony around the purchase of a pair of shoes that they create out of savings products, and yet they complain savings rates are too low? I think you can solve fundamentally serious and important problems. People don't complete their courses of antibiotics. Take a lesson from the software industry, the loading bar, if you like. Don't give people 24 white pills. Give them 18 white pills and 6 blue ones, and say, when you finish the white ones, take the blue ones. The chance that people will get to the end of the whole series if you have an intermediate point, however artificially generated, is much, much higher. It's a really, really simple thing to do. And actually, there's a problem here because behavioral economics, most of the really important psychological instincts which affect what we do not emerge. First of all, they don't emerge out of logic. So simply using economic logic will not get you there. In fact, very little human behavior, even economic behavior, is very close to that predicted by standard economic models. In many categories, not even the most basic assumption of economics, which is that demand goes up as price goes down. If you work in the art world, it's a fairly common saying that if you've had a painting in the window for 2 weeks for £2,000 and it doesn't sell, double the price. The reason is, in the art world, there are people wandering around who want to buy a £4,000 painting who don't want to buy a £2,000 painting. In many cases, the price-quality thing actually works backwards, in wine being perhaps the most obvious example of that. So logic doesn't get you to this stuff, and market research doesn't. Why? Because most of this stuff is instinctive. It comes from something called a heuristic, which has evolved over millions of years, and the very fact that it's an instinct means that we're not consciously aware of it acting upon us. Just to give you an idea of this, physicists, nuclear physicists, theoretical physicists, mathematicians know how you're supposed to catch a cricket ball. They're, however, pretty crap cricketers, because by the time they've actually solved the maths, the ball has landed 200 yards away. Very good cricketers catch balls very regularly and have no idea how they do it. You have to do experiments to find out how. And they use exactly the same heuristic that dogs use to catch frisbees, which gives you some idea of how ancient this thing is in terms of its place in the human brain. What it is apparently is you look up at a high ball and then you run towards it at such a speed as keeps the angle of gaze constant. It's a very efficient way of catching a ball, or a frisbee if you're a dog, or just a slightly childish human. It's a very good way of catching those things, simply because you're actually getting closer to the ball at the same time as you're solving the problem. It's also incredibly cognitively efficient in terms of the amount of actual mental effort it requires is much, much less than the math solution. How long? 5 minutes? About that. OK. I'll skip this, in which case, another vital problem. I'll go back to that one very quickly. That's another problem. People actually act and then actually form their opinions based on their actions. People don't, Bob Dylan put this in Brownsville Girl, people don't do what they say they believe, they do what's convenient and then they repent. Paul Dolan and I, he's a professor at the London School of Economics, came up with this rather depressing phrase, which I think is nonetheless true. When a man says, my wife doesn't understand me, it doesn't mean he's going to have an affair, it means he's already had one. That actually most human opinion and attitude follows behavior rather than preceding it. What blokes don't do is, I'm noticing slightly declining levels of empathy here. I think I might outsource a range of sexual services. What actually happens is bloke gets pissed at party, does something he never intended to do, and in a desperate attempt to make sense of his incongruous actions, constructs an entirely bogus case against his wife. We're basically a post-rationalizing species. And one case of sheer genius where this has been used in selling the Olympic tickets. Because what that is about is actually getting people to act before they form an opinion. Now, the Olympics is actually an extraordinary con, really. They get cities to spend billions of pounds staging 2 weeks of sports that nobody's very interested in at all. And indeed, the only event in the whole Olympics which could actually count as being faintly interesting lasts 9.7 seconds. All the interesting sports, like cricket, are for some bizarre reason stripped out. Anybody explain why baseball is also stripped out of some peculiar anti-Anglo-Saxon bias on the part of the organizers? But what they did brilliantly for the Olympics is they got people, through scarcity bias and through raising this obsession of rarity, to buy the tickets. And what you'll find is people who ended up with bicycling tickets have now decided that they're very, very interested in cycling. The action actually precedes the attitude. So very, very quickly, I'll just... one final little insight. Our perception is relative. A and B, A is much darker than B, you all agree that. Actually, if I change the context, after 5 seconds, you'll see they're exactly the same color. Yet if I revert to the original point, it's now impossible for you to see that again. All our perception about value, about what things are like, it's all relative. £3,000 rebate on your old car is perceived as much, much more valuable than 3,000 knocked off the purchase price of your new car. Every single thing, the price of things, is not an absolute. We don't have an internal measure of pleasure against which we measure our expenditure. It's completely relative. So I'll very, very quickly. The vital thing is that we have a frame of reference with everything we buy, and what we're prepared to pay with it depends on what that frame is. Nespresso does a brilliant thing. Extraordinarily clever thing. If you actually had to fill it up with Nescafe, you'd realize you're paying about £200 for a large jar of Nescafe, those of you who have an espresso machine. And you'd be unable to do this. Because it comes in beautiful little pods, your frame of reference is Starbucks rather than Nescafe. And you go, well, it's a shot of espresso. That would cost me £1 in Starbucks. The machine's practically paying for itself. So relativism affects all our perception of value. Video conferencing suffers because we see it as an inferior good to air travel. The fact that it's intrinsically very good doesn't matter. It's margarine to British Airways butter. That's why it suffered. They should have marketed video conferencing as the rich man's phone call, not as the poor man's flight. It was a bit like the pager. You know, it was what your boss gave you when they didn't trust you with a mobile phone. And the video conferences, we won't let Sutherland go to Frankfurt because he'll only get pissed and watch a porn film on the hotel. So we'll let him go to an underground room and look at a pixelated image of Jürgen for 15 minutes, right? Coach travel is an inferior good. George Monbiot makes the point, it is the most environmentally friendly form of transport. But vitally, and I'll just come to the very, very quick end here because I'm running hideously over. Yield management is a fascinating and big idea which embraces all three. You all know yield management, EasyJet pricing. It's where price and demand actually keep pace. What's interesting about yield management is it's not purely a triumph of technology and a triumph of economics. It's also a triumph of psychology. 30 years ago, we didn't accept yield management. If we were sitting on a plane next to somebody and we found out they'd paid less than we had, we blamed the airline. Now we blame ourselves. And there are still huge obstacles to more efficient systems of pricing, which are psychological, not economic, and not technological. In car parks, 5 or 10 spaces in a car park should cost twice as much as all the others. So there's always a space if you're desperate. On the streets, every 10th space in a parking slot should be more expensive than the others, so someone who just desperately needs to park can find a parking space. When you get to the airport and there's a massive queue to go through security, you should be able to pay £10 more and go through a fast-track queue. Why doesn't all this happen? The reason it doesn't happen is because psychologically we find that objectionable. We'd simply suspect that the airline was creating an artificially large queue in security in order to gouge us for £5 or £10 in order to go through the faster queue. So I'll ask a little question. Can you solve this problem not by looking at technology, which is great, and not by looking at economics, which is already finds yield management an extraordinary interesting thing, but through psychology? What about the idea of charitable yield management, where you pay £10 to go through a faster lane, but it goes to a charity? How many problems could be solved, parking likewise, if you actually sensibly had a differential level of service, a differential provision of a perishable good, but where the premium didn't actually go to the owner of the good, it intelligently went to a third-party charity? Would people find this less revolting? Coke tried a yield management Coke vending machine where the price varied according to temperature. They had to remove it because people went bonkers. They thought it was cynical and unpleasant. If you make these things charitable, do they actually serve the purpose in terms of smoothing out yield, while at the same time not making people think they're revolting? Touts make a fortune out of sporting events precisely because bands and acts don't like to price to maximum efficiency. So the gains go to the touts instead. Could those gains that touts actually collect go to charity instead? And finally, promise, the biggest problem of all could be solved this way. Could we charge a charitable premium which finally stops retired people from shopping on Saturday and Sunday? Thank you very much indeed.